Something was off. That was what Ensign J. Seán thought to himself that morning. As the alarm gently nudged him awake, the first thing he felt was uncomfortable. It wasn't confined to any one spot, more just a general sense of unease throughout his whole body. As he lurched upwards, he could feel the weight of his muscles try to pull him back down. It was a valiant attempt, but he had work to do as always, so he stood up, stretched, and looked around his room. Same as ever. The dull grey walls of an officer's quarters, decorated with geometric red and white furniture, some framed photos of family Jay hadn't seen in years, and prints from various artists, classical and modern, breaking up the dull grey fog. Jay looked out the great curved windows to see the stars passing by in tiny beams of light. Warp 3, he thought. He'd check the computer later to see if he was right. Over the past few months, he'd made a habit of trying to guess the ship's speed every morning because that's just the kind of thing you do when you spend a lot of time in your own head. So far, he had a perfect record. As he began to trudge towards the bathroom, he felt his stride was longer than usual. He splashed some water on his face and looked at himself in the mirror above the sink, perfectly clean. That was when it clicked. He'd been serving aboard the Miranda for 3 years now. When was the last time he'd really reflected on that time? He moved over to a different mirror, a full-body one this time, just outside his wardrobe, and stared at himself. He was taller, his arm muscles more defined, his chin more grizzled than he'd ever noticed before. He'd even started to show wrinkles around his eyes and a small gut around his belly. When he'd first come aboard 3 years ago, he'd been eager to learn, but weak and inexperienced. Now he'd been doing the same dull routine for 3 years. He almost felt alien to himself. His sudden onset midlife crisis was interrupted by a doorbell chime. He ran over to the intercom to accept it and heard a familiar voice.
Hey Jay, you alright?
It was Kurana Sophia, one of his co-workers down in secondary engineering. What was she doing here? She sounded worried.
Yes, I'm fine, thank you. Why, is everything okay?
Well, you didn't show up for breakfast? I thought something had happened.
Breakfast? But isn't it still...
He looked over at his wall clock. It was almost 9. His alarm had been an hour ago. Just how long had he been stuck in his own head again?
Oh, for goodness sake.
He swore, his finger still on the intercom button.
Are you decent? I want to come in?
And that threw him off guard.
Decent?
He replied incredulously, then looked down at himself.
Give me just a moment.
3 minutes later, he had his uniform on and opened the door for Kurana. She was a fairly short woman in a matching uniform with hair tied up in a neck-length ponytail. She liked to say that her size helped her fit into ventilation tubes and other tight spaces much more comfortably than her co-workers, and she had generally a cheery, if snarky, personality. What was unusual, though, was that she carried a donut and a cup of what smelled like very strong coffee. She stood in the doorway and offered them to him with a smile. Jay just stared at the donut, dumbfounded, like he'd never seen one before in his life. It had chocolate icing on it.
Well?
Kurana prompted again. Jay's brain was still stuck on the donut problem, so when his body moved to accept the offerings, it was doing so of its own accord. At that moment, he developed just enough social awareness to say, "Thank you." Kurana looked at him, relieved, and invited herself into the room.
Not like you to sleep in, is it?
She said, looking around and helping herself to a seat on one of the oddly geometric chairs.
I was getting pretty worried, so I thought I'd come up to check on you. You got nice quarters, by the way.
Thanks.
He said, taking a bite of the donut. He wouldn't outwardly show it, but it was delicious.
I thought you needed special permission to take food out of the canteen.
Oh, are you really complaining when I'm good enough to bring you breakfast? Maybe I shouldn't have bothered.
Oh no, it's fine. It's great, in fact.
Seriously though, are you alright?
She leaned forward, and it felt like she'd pushed the entire weight of the room on top of him. Jay stared at her, appraising the situation. Kurana had joined the crew maybe 6 months ago, on their last supply stop before entering unknown space. Since then, the two of them had become co-workers, even friends, but neither had ever had to fully trust the other before. Jay looked her up and down, trying to figure out if she was worth trusting with his little out-of-body experience. Then he looked down at the donut and coffee. She brought him breakfast and checked up on him when he was late. How many people in his life could he say had done that for him? Not many. And now she was staring at him with caring eyes, hoping for an honest answer. She deserved that at least, so he put the food down.
What am I doing here, Kurana?
Huh?
I mean, why am I here, on this ship? It's been 3 years and I still don't know what I'm doing.
Too right. If there's a single person on this ship who knows what they're doing, then I'm a talking horse.
I feel like I've been doing the same thing for 3 years. Same routine, same uniform, same coffee. Before I knew it, I had grown into someone I don't recognize. It's like you wake up one day and suddenly you're in a whole new body.
Kurana didn't speak for a moment, mulling over what he'd just said. The silence was brief, but it weighed on them both.
Think I get it.
Jay looked up at her, surprised.
Honestly, everyone gets that kind of revelation, especially in a job like this.
Does that mean you've...
Oh yeah, loads of times. I've worked boring job to boring job, spaceship to spaceship, and one morning, every few years, you wake up, look at yourself and think, who's this bird?
How do you deal with that feeling?
Kurana shrugged.
Just means you've grown, innit? It's still you behind the eyes.
Jay breathed out. It was an annoyingly practical answer, but it was the truth. The world changes and your life moves when you're not looking, but it's still you, no matter what.
Nah, I hate to cut this little natter short, but if you don't eat up, we'll be late for shift.
Oh, right,
said Jay, scarfing down the rest of the donut. 2 decks down, in a more traditionally exciting part of the story, Ensign Louis Drossel was experiencing a much more literal interpretation of the word dissociation. His mind was locked up in a box and thrown somewhere quiet, while his body was put under new management. It got up, got dressed, and moved robotically towards primary engineering. Louis didn't know what his new host wanted. He wasn't even really aware of what was happening. The Miranda had an intruder. This ship had entered unknown space only 4 days ago. Specifically, they were flying through the appropriately named Ghost Sector, famed for tall tales of alien encounters and ships returning with strangely damaged instruments. It was only a few light years across, but it was still uncharted because ships always went around it. People called it the Bermuda Triangle of the Andromeda Galaxy, and this was the first time an Earth Force starship was attempting to map it. 2 decks up, Jay and Kurana were out the door and on their way to secondary engineering. Every crewmate was expected to be punctual, but this was rush hour, and the foot traffic was ridiculous. Alongside the pair, 13 other people were trying to fit themselves into an elevator meant for 6 at most, making the tiny Kurana look even smaller by comparison. 6 months of this had made it fairly normal by now, but she still stuck close to Jay. She imagined that he barely even noticed the squeeze anymore. They stopped on deck 9, and 2 people got off, a challenge of spatial reasoning, while another 3 got on, compressing everyone even more. Just one more floor, just one more floor, she told herself. At last, they made it to deck 12, and she and Jay managed to pull each other out.
Whew. Oh, finally I can breathe.
Said Kurana, hands on her hips, while Jay took a moment against the wall.
It's not so bad.
Yeah, says the man leaning against a wall. Whew.
And like that, he was up and walking. Kurana almost had to jog to keep up with him. Was he trying to impress her after that talk in his quarters? That was almost cute, she thought, like a dog who slipped on a patch of ice. The door to secondary engineering was roughly half the size of main engineering, as was the area itself. There were warp batteries in here, sure, but the open space was nowhere near big enough to accommodate the larger team that main engineering required. The purpose of secondary, then, was to be the backup engine in case the first one failed. The warp batteries were inlaid to the back wall, right next to an airlock leading to the reactor's internals. Every other wall was filled with screens and consoles showing ship schematics, energy levels, and other important information. There was also a separate desk right by the front door, occupied by a man whose white hair was more likely a product of stress than age. He stood up when the pair entered.
"You two are late,"
he said matter-of-factly. He wasn't a man who expressed much emotion.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Hobbes.
"Lieutenant Commander."
Lieutenant Commander?
Got a bit distracted, didn't we?
Said Jay, the active parts of his brain suddenly scrambling for an excuse.
Oh, right. Sorry, sir. My fault. I broke my mirror. Had to clean it up.
And I helped.
Come on, mate. I know you're not that ugly.
Came a voice from one of the consuls. Tom Herring, ensign. Same as them, but a younger man.
Thanks, Tom.
Jay was obviously not the most socially adept of people. He'd grown up in a small town with few people to talk to, and those that did were elderly and formal sounding. In terms of personality, he wasn't exactly quiet and liked to spend time with his crewmates after hours, but he certainly wasn't the most outgoing of people either.
"I don't care why you're late, or why Miss Sophia,
Ensign Sophia?
or why Ensign Sophia felt she needed help. Just get to your posts and get to work."
Yes, sir.
There wasn't actually much to do in secondary engineering. Their job was mainly to keep an eye on things and make the space available to the primary engineering crew in case of an emergency in the big room. Kurana sat down at her console next to Ensign Tarai and stared at the screen.
So what happened?
I ain't saying a thing on my life. It's our secret.
Must be important then.
Already told ya. I ain't saying nothing.
With that, Tarai gave up and slid back to her console, still smiling. In Jay's corner, he glanced at the screen showing the active engine readouts. Warp 3. Record kept. A short walk away, the creature inhabiting the body of Louis Drossel had made its way to main engineering. There had been an awkward encounter in the elevator where a crewmate had greeted the body. The creature had done its best to manipulate the muscles used for human speech, and the crew member seemed satisfied with the exchange. But if that interaction had gone on any longer, the deception might have been discovered. The entity made its way swiftly to main engineering and stopped in front of the door, scanning the room. It took in the shield schematics, the life support system, and many other consoles, but it seemed to be looking for something else. Finally, it found the main engine command console and started inputting a sequence of instructions faster than a human hand could reasonably move. It looked up and spotted Commander Diana Levnis, chief engineer, typing something out at her personal console, probably a morning report. She hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary yet. That was good. It finished inputting the strange sequence and set them to hold for a while before executing. The creature still wanted a clean getaway, so it walked over to a random, unattended console and tried to look busy. Roughly 10 minutes later, emergency icons started appearing in everyone's monitors. Engineers jumped out of their seats, and the creature tried its best to look panicked.
Heat's building rapidly in battery number 3. No, number 2.
I've shut down the engines, but the heat's still building.
Why isn't the coolant connected?
Levnis was rapidly pressing buttons on the main engine consoles, barking orders to shut down the engines. Outside, in space, the Miranda came to a complete stop. The reddish glow from the engine abruptly faded, and the ship began to drift.
Main engineering, this is the captain. What's going on down there?
Came a voice through the intercom.
Captain, we have an emergency down here. The venting system's been disrupted and the batteries were building up heat rapidly.
Can you get us moving again?
Just a few more seconds.
Not until I can figure out the problem. It might be better to switch over to the...
The glass on battery 1 cracked with an explosion, and toxic fumes began pouring into the room. Levnis ended the intercom call immediately.
Battery leak! Battery leak! Everyone out! Let's go! Let's go!
She screamed, her engineers all running as fast as they could to evacuate the room. Levnis got out last and sealed the engine room behind her. A few engineers were coughing, and one was throwing up, but there didn't seem to be any major injuries.
Someone get that man to the medical centre,
she said, walking over another nearby intercom.
Captain, our primary warp batteries just went up. I didn't even have time to figure out why.
Diana, is everyone alright?
Levnis looked around at her team again.
Maybe some mild cases of radiation poisoning, but nothing major.
Commander,
said a voice from behind her, interrupting the call. It was the creature.
Would it not be wise to make it to secondary engineering and get the ship moving as soon as possible?
If you think you're well enough, Drossel.
I am, Commander.
You heard him, Captain. Notify secondary that we're on our way. We'll have the ship moving again in under an hour.
Thank you, Diana. Remember, we're on a tight schedule here. I want out of this sector as soon as possible. Understood?
Understood. Oh, and Captain?
Yes, Commander.
Levnis paused to think through her next sentence.
Send a security team down here too. We still don't know what caused the leak.
Are you thinking sabotage?
I just want to be sure.
Levnis let go of the intercom. And we almost died down here, she thought. She looked out over her crew, leaning against the walls, breathing in recycled, but clean, air. Some looking like they were having difficulty standing up straight. Only Drosel seemed unaffected.
Alright, anyone who's still able, come join me in second engineering. This is just a minor setback. If we all band together, we can have the ship moving again. Who's with me?
The response was less of a cheer and more of a groan. Secondary engineering was a whirlwind. They'd received a word from the captain just a few minutes ago and were rushing to get everything ready for the main engine crew, charting the warp batteries, opening up connector ports that hadn't been opened in almost 3 years, and dusting off consoles that had probably never been used before.
We've got 10 minutes!
What exactly happened?
Asked Jay, getting one of the many diagnostic systems up and running. Hobbes took a moment before answering.
I don't know for sure. I heard something about a gas leak.
Gas leak? What kind of gas leak?
Asked Kurana from the other end of the room.
I don't know. All I know for sure is that they had to evacuate the main engineering, and now they're all coming down here. And they're gonna need us ready and willing when they do. They've got a lot of expectations, these guys.
Jay raised an eyebrow but kept working.
Sir, with all due respect, I don't think they're looking to be impressed right now. They just want to get their situation solved.
I think he's right, Chief. Soon as they get in here, we're probably out of here.
No, Ensign. They're going to need us here. Every man on deck, as they say. And Mr. Syrian...
Ensign Syrian?
Yes?
You're right, they'll want a problem solved. But we have to be here to help them solve it. That's our role here on this ship. Be proud.
You think I'm gonna be proud doing this job?
Shouted Tarai, fussing over a console.
We're bottom tier, the lowest rung of the ship.
Hobbes looked appalled. He was used to some mild ribbing from his staff, but never something this outright.
Yeah, but don't shout it out, bud.
Hobbes breathed in deeply and strolled over to her.
Miss Tarai, if I recall, you were suspended from your last commission for insubordination and failing to follow ship's protocols. Frankly, I think you're lucky to be here at all.
Tarai sighed dramatically.
Yes, sir. I'm very sorry.
Hobbes knew it wasn't genuine, but what could you do? He was well aware of their nobody position on the ship. He doubted the captain even knew his name, but he'd learned to take what he could get.
And if I hear any more insubordination out of you, I'm taking it straight to the top.
Like you could even find the...
She muttered, but Kurana clamped a hand over her mouth before Tarai could finish the sentence that would end her career. Hobbes turned around again.
Everything all right, Miss Sophia?
Peachy, Chief,
she said quickly, and Hobbes kept on walking. When he was out of earshot, Kurana shot her a look that could only have said, "Idiot."
What do you think you're doing, you muppet?
Am I not allowed to express an opinion around here? You make fun of him all the time.
I don't mean it. It's just banter. I'm not out here calling everyone bottom rung, am I?
Before she'd even finished her sentence, the door swung open and the worn-looking engineering crew dragged themselves in, followed by a team of 4 strong and frightening-looking men in blue security uniforms.
Alright, everybody out.
Shouted the tall woman leading the crew, who looked like her patience was already near its limit. Kurana recognized her immediately. That was Diana Levnis. Slowly, she inched her way backwards until she was facing the other way, putting Tarai between the two of them. Hobbes immediately jumped to attention.
Commander Levnis, secondary engineering is ready and willing to receive your orders at any time.
Well, my orders are to get out. We can take over from here, Mr.
Hobbes, Mum. But if you need any...
Actually,
said one of the security guards suddenly.
We prefer if everyone stay where we can see them. We already have another officer on their way to the medical center to oversee the injured.
What? Why?
You said it yourself. If you suspect sabotage, then we need to take every precaution,
he said, his face perfectly expressionless.
You were sabotaged?
Asked Hobbes, just loud enough to get the attention of everyone else in the room. Levnis looked at him with enraged eyes, and Kurana could tell she was maybe an inch away from smacking him. She'd almost been on the receiving end of one of those herself, and she knew that Diana was a very angry person. Levnis paused to breathe.
It's just a possibility, Mr. Hobbes. Now please, would everyone back off for a minute and let me do my job?
She shouted, and the sea of people parted. She headed straight for the warp battery command console and started firing up the ship's engines. It was sluggish, but the Miranda slowly began to move again. The creature was in a bind. It needed to get to the command console without arousing suspicion, but with the security officers watching everyone so closely, that had suddenly become a lot harder. It had maybe 2 body jumps left, but as soon as it did, this host would collapse. It wondered if it could get the job done fast enough before this host revealed its presence. It didn't know how long these creatures take to recover from a possession, so would it risk it? Or would it ensure that this host cannot talk after it leaves? It looked around the console space in front of it. No weapons to speak of. But any computer console could be a weapon if misused the right way. The security gorillas had shoved the secondary engineering crew into a corner out of the way, and Jay and Kurana were, again, squashed shoulder to shoulder. Or rather, shoulder to elbow, in their case. Around them were mutterings of, "Sabotage? Are they okay? And what's gonna happen next?"
Told ya!
And Hobbes didn't have the will to argue back.
Let's not, shall we?
Kurana shrugged. The motion and their closeness made his shoulder rise too. Jay had begun to feel rather awkward, more so than in the elevator, because at least you could call that a normal occurrence. Being shoved into a corner in your place of work, like penguins huddling against a storm, was not.
Hey, Kurana.
What's up?
Thanks. For this morning.
It's no problem, mate. You sound like it's the end of the world.
I don't mean to, but if what they're saying is true, then we might be in real danger.
Oh, you heard Diana. It's just a small chance. Probably nothing to worry about.
I know. I do hope I'm just being paranoid, but... Wait.
What?
Did you just call her Diana?
Kurana looked taken aback for a second, like she didn't realize the problem. Then she realized and tried to formulate a response.
Oh, well,
Before she could get her answer out, a scream tore through the engine room. Everyone looked over and saw Ensign Drusel, lit up by electricity as lightning seemed to fire out of the console. He managed to rip his hands free and stumble back.
Drusel!
Shouted Diana, rushing over. 1 second, Drusel's eyes were wide open. The second, a bright flash lasting less than a second. Then the noise resumed, and people were crowding around Drusel's body. One person shakily said, "He's breathing," and another breathed a sigh of relief. The people crowding around the body slowly started to panic while the security officers desperately tried to restore order. Jay regained control of his attention span and looked for Kurana. She was still next to him, rubbing her eyes.
Hey, you alright?
Oh, fine. But what the bloody hell was that?
I'm not sure. You heard what they said about that ensign, right?
That flash.
Someone from behind them said.
You think that's what conked him?
Shut up, all of you. If you want this to be over quickly, you keep your mouths shut and your backs straight.
Yes, sir.
Jay tried not to focus on the chaos. He was looking at something, anything else to distract himself. He hadn't realized it, but he'd put his arm around Kurana's shoulder, only noticing when she brought her hand up to hold his.
Hey, what's Diana doing?
Jay quickly scanned the room, and then he noticed it too. There were 2 groups of people in this room. The one crowded around Drusel, and them, shoved into a corner by a security officer who had long since abandoned his post to deal with the first group. Diana Levnis was in neither of them. She was at the warp battery command console, seemingly unfazed by everything going on behind her. Without thinking, Jay began walking toward her.
Ensign!
Hobbes protested, but was duly ignored. He got right behind her, but she didn't seem to notice him.
Commander Levnis?
He asked, but got no response. He put a hand on her shoulder.
Commander, what are you typing?
Suddenly, she spun around and hit him hard in the chin. Strength was supernatural. It sent Jay flying backwards. She quickly turned back and continued typing, faster this time.
Jay!
Screamed Kurana and ran over to him.
Stop her!
Shouted the lead security officer. The other 2 grabbed her by the arms, but were neatly flung away. Something began to rumble inside the warp battery. The creature continued typing for a few more seconds before a jolt of electricity sent her crumbling to the ground like wet tissue paper. The security chief had fired his stun gun. Kurana dashed to the controls to shut down whatever the creature had done. The security chief panicked and raised his gun again, but Hobbes jumped between them.
Sir, wait!
He yelled, arms raised wide.
She's fine. We just have to shut down the engine again.
Are you willing to take that chance?
He stammered. He was trying to maintain an air of calm, but there was a slight tremble in his voice.
Well, you're free to point a gun at my head if it makes you feel better, but if someone doesn't turn the engines off now, then we're liable to overheat. Then where do you think we'll be?
The security chief raised an eyebrow, genuinely confused.
Does she always talk to superior officers like that?
Oh, yes,
said Jay, picking himself up from the ground.
That's how you know she's still herself.
It was out of Jay's sight, but Kurana smiled a sweet smile, and the loud whirring of the engines descended into a low hum, and the red emergency light switched itself off. Slowly, the security chief lowered his gun, and everyone breathed out. The poor Diana Levnis was lying crumpled on the floor, still breathing. He and Jay gingerly began to pick her up off the ground when her eyes shot open. A flash. And Jay wasn't where he was a moment ago. He looked around, but all he could see was blackness. Strangely, he didn't feel panicked. He didn't feel like screaming or running for help. He was just vaguely curious.
Your body is mine,
came an inhuman voice. It sounded like it was all around him, and yet, somehow, behind him. He turned around again, but nothing was there. Then he felt something touch his shoulder, and he recoiled. He leapt forward and turned again, seeing just the faintest outline of something vaguely humanoid, but writhing. He stood still and waited, and like clockwork he felt its touch again and spun around as fast as he could. He'd been right. The figure was humanoid, but with a sharp head. A single spike pointed up and behind, like some kind of dinosaur, but its body was a wriggling mass of things that looked like they were struggling to keep a humanoid shape.
Your body is mine. You will give it to me,
it said again as 6 large tentacles sprouted from its back. Jay wanted to run, but couldn't. It felt like his feet had been glued to the ground. The monster, meanwhile, slowly began to lose its human shape and grow, spreading itself upwards and outwards to engulf him. Then he thought about himself, and how he suddenly felt so distant from the feelings he'd been having this morning, just like the him from this morning felt so distant from the him of 3 years ago. Finally, he thought about his friends and about Kurana, who'd been so kind to him. Suddenly, a bright light flashed, and a humanoid shape leapt forwards and hit the creature from behind. Its head was knocked away from its body, and the writhing mass fell to the ground, chasing its tumbling cranium. He looked back and realized he could move again. Then he took in the figure that had come to his aid. It was him.
Jay, don't move.
Mere seconds had passed since the flash, and Jay was standing up straight but swaying like he was about to topple over.
Someone lay him down.
Tarai and a few others took Jay's body and laid him gently on the floor, convulsing slightly. His eyes were turned upwards and he didn't seem aware of his surroundings. Hobbes pulled them apart and looked him over. Not that his medical expertise would have been of any use.
We've got to get him to the medical centre right now.
You think they know how to fix this?
Asked Tom, gesturing at the 3 bodies on the floor. That was when he noticed that Drusel was starting to stir.
They've got a damn sight better chance than we do,
said Kurana, but stopped when she saw Tom gesturing to Drusel. He'd started to pick himself up and people were crowding around him again. The security chief stepped up to them.
You all stay exactly where you were. No interactions with his ensign and no leaving this room.
What?
Excuse me, officer.
Came a voice from their side. It was Lieutenant Commander Hobbes, with his arms folded.
I don't believe your position allows you to detain us during a medical emergency.
Excuse me?
EF Ship Law Article 225, I believe. No enforcer of ship security may deny a ship's crew member access to immediate medical attention or prescription medication for any reason.
He recited, looking ridiculously smug. Shockingly, the security chief seemed to be mulling it over, firing neurons that had probably never been fired before.
I think that's right?
Good. That's all I needed to hear,
said Hobbes as quickly as he could. He gestured for Kurana and Tom to get out fast.
You'll definitely be getting a promotion out of this, Lieutenant.
Kurana and Tom booked it as fast as 2 people can book it, while carrying a large man between them. Jay's feet slid and scraped against the ground as they moved.
So, what do we know? Bright flash, then the commander starts acting weird.
Then another flash, and Syrian starts acting weird. You think the light messed with his brain or something?
Then why aren't we all affected?
In the engineering room, Hobbes pushed through the crowd to get to Dressel.
Ensign, are you alright?
Dressel looked dazed and confused.
Sir?
It's me, son. Can you tell me what happened?
He said gently. It looked like Dressel was already under enough stress. The ensign strained, trying to recall anything.
I think something had taken over me?
Maybe it only targets one person? I'm pretty sure Jay was right over the commander when the other flash happened.
So was the Monkey King, but he seems to be his usual self. Nah, this thing's gotta be targeted.
So, some kind of possession?
You meet some crazy aliens here, don't ya?
But why would this alien go into Syrian, though? If it was trying to overheat the warp batteries, then aren't we moving it away from where it wants to be?
Kurana stopped so suddenly that it almost made Tom and Jay fall over.
Because it was rumbled. It figured it was found out. So it jumped into someone who we'd carry away.
Jay Syrian stopped shaking.
So we were...
The escape route,
said Kurana, before the two of them were pushed to the ground with incredible strength. The creature began to run as Kurana shot back up, but then something strange happened. Jay was just standing there, frozen in a running position.
Jay?
She tried and helped Tom up off the ground. Jay didn't respond. He just stayed frozen. Slowly, she stepped around him and saw his face, perfectly blank, eyes staring straight ahead. He said, but was unable to move his mouth. Inside the void, Jay was able to get a better look at the him who'd come to his rescue. He was slightly younger, clean-shaven with less muscle. His uniform looked freshly pressed and a bit loose, not like the worn, stretched fabric of his own. He didn't speak, but he was carrying a large plank of wood and, with his free hand pointed at the creature trying to reform itself, gestured for them both to run. Jay quickly agreed. As they were running, a million thoughts began springing through Jay's mind, but first and foremost was...
How do I get out?
He looked at the other him and saw he was making another gesture. He seems to be pinching himself.
Does he want me to wake up? Am I asleep? Is that it?
He smacked himself hard across the face, and for a moment, he could see the corridors of the Miranda. Then he was right back in the void.
Didn't work. Gonna need something harder.
Whoa, you see that?
Yeah. His head just twitched. Shot out sideways and back again.
Does that mean anything?
How the bloody hell should I know? And what are you still doing here? Go and fetch some help.
You really okay being left alone with that thing?
That thing is Jay. Just go. I'll be fine. I promise.
She did her best to assuage him until finally he ran off, presumably towards the medical center.
What do you want, Jay? I don't know,
she said before Jay's head shot sideways again, only this time with more force. It was like he'd been punched by an invisible fist and stumbled into the wall.
Oh my god!
She screamed and jumped to catch him. He didn't move to pick himself up, so he slowly slid to the ground while Kurana tried to support his body. He was a lot heavier than her, so it wasn't like she could do much to hold him up on her own. His voice was slurred, but the word was clear enough.
Hit!
Come on, please work.
Begged Jay as he continued running through the void. He'd been slapping himself and trying to think the words for ages now, hoping it was having an effect outside. He thought he'd caught a glimpse of Kurana in his last smack and he was out in the corridor, so he could only conclude that she was trying to carry him to the medical center. He had to get this message out, something to wake him up. He turned back and could see the creature gaining on them. The other him readied his plank of wood and charged.
Come on, Kurana, hit me, please! Me.
You what?
Me.
Kurana looked around. No one else in the corridor, no one else to help. Hitting someone she was fond of was the last thing she wanted to do, but this might just save his life. Or would it? She didn't know. She never hesitated at taking a risk before. With a few deep breaths, she steeled herself and smacked J. Syrian across the face as hard as she could. Almost instantly, the dark void turned white, and Jay was blinded. He heard a faint scream and a roar in his own voice before suddenly he was in the ship's corridor, and he realized his face hurt really bad. He tried to sit up and mumbled something painful to himself. He thought he even caught a glimpse of white smoke escaping down the corridor before Kurana filled his whole world. She lay on the floor with him, arms wrapped around his waist, face buried in his chest.
Kurana?
Shh. Don't look down, whatever you do.
Jay rested his arms around her shoulders.
Thank you. Again.
She gripped him tighter for a moment, then suddenly pulled herself up. Her eyes and cheeks had reddened, but she seemed to have recomposed herself.
Never do that to me again. You scared the devil out of me, you know?
Jay's lips turned to a soft smile.
I'm sorry, I'll do my best, alright? Now can we please get me to the medical center?
Kurana breathed in deeply and helped them both up off the floor.
Well, that was probably the weirdest experience of my life.
You're telling me? What was it like?
Jay thought for a moment and realized it was actually hard to picture, like a dream that slowly fades away after waking.
It felt lonely, being separated from everyone, from everything. It's just you and the thing that wants to eat you. What happened out here?
You told me to hit you. So I did. Great big plume of smoke and light came out of your mouth.
Fascinating. And it just flew away?
Pretty much. Ran off down that corridor into the recycler. You think he's coming back?
I don't know. Hopefully it's smart enough not to try this again. Especially since it knows we're on the lookout now.
Right, yeah. Gotta stay vigilant and all that.
Right. Plus, the other me gave it a pretty good whack on the head.
Wait. You what?
Oh, well, I had a bit of help in there. But again, it's hard to explain.
He looked around the corridor and noticed his face, reflected in a wall-mounted console. It stared back at him, chin still grizzled, hair still graying too young. Still him. Always just him.
Thank you.
He thought to himself. Kurana scratched the back of her head.
Well, I'll take your word for it, I suppose. Not like I've got any room to argue with this alien stuff. Way over my head.
I won't pretend I'm knowledgeable either. It's not like we've actually met an alien before.
The conversation paused for a moment, but suddenly the inactive parts of Jay's brain began scrambling for new things to talk about.
Why am I suddenly scared of losing the conversation?
He thought. He looked at Kurana, the redness now almost gone from her face, and thought how beautiful she was. Not when she was on her knees, crying into his uniform, but now, when the world had a semblance of normality and the two could just talk.
I suppose that's another thing I owe you. What can I do to thank you for all of this? For everything today?
Hang on. You want to thank me for slapping you in the face? Is that what I'm hearing?
You know what I mean.
Kurana pursed her lips and thought for a moment.
You could stand to invite me round more often?
You mean to my quarters?
Yeah. Or out. You know, to the mess hall, rec rooms, or a date every now and then.
Jay stopped mid-step and blushed bright red.
Wait, have I been oblivious this whole time?
Finally, the fella gets it. Ding, ding, ding.
She laughed and threw an arm around him. Jay could feel the different parts of his brain crossing wires. In his eyes, the room started to spin.
Whoa. How? Am I an idiot?
I wouldn't go that far.
But
And finally, his brain gave up trying to solve a problem and just accepted its fate.
Oh, screw it. I think that's a great idea.
I love you too, buddy. You still standing all right?
Better than before. But now I don't want to let go of you.
He said and pulled her in close to him. The two laughed and kept walking. This hallway seemed to go on forever.
Suppose we tell Hobbes about this. He'd go bloody mental.
Suppose we tell Tarai.
Oh God, I don't think I could look her in the eye ever again. Or Tom, or Diana.
Is she a friend of yours?
I wouldn't say friend. Not anymore. I've got a fun little history with her. Maybe I'll tell you one day.
Jay decided not to pry further. A few minutes later, Tom came rushing to meet them with a medical team, and Jay was dragged away to be observed. He ended up there for almost 2 days, plus interrogations by ship security. Dressel and Levnis got those too, and all three even received visits from the captain. No further incidents of possession were reported, but Hobbes did in fact explode when he found out Jay and Kurana had started dating. Tarai, on the other hand, seemed to melt at the news, and was only able to communicate in high-pitched squeals for the rest of the week. Life on the Miranda would continue as normal for a good while, but a big ship sauntering through unknown space was bound to run into incidents eventually. From that point on, Jay always looked in the mirror with purpose, taking stock of who he was, and Kurana helped to keep the daily grind from taking over again. You never know what's around the next star, they thought, so they had to cherish what they had now. And the Miranda never sleeps.